I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 35. Build-up in Jeddah. 10th August 1990. 16th Airborne Corps. Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The C-141 and C-130 aircraft were dominating the airport in Jeddah. Coming in a close second were the civilian airliners the U.S. military had pulled into service, ferrying battalion after battalion of soldiers from the U.S. Both the civilian and military aircraft were on the ground only long enough to unload before heading back to the U.S. for another load. It was quickly becoming one of the largest logistical moves in decades. Soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as support troops from the 1st Corps Support Command, were arriving on an hourly basis. 18th Airborne Corps Headquarters Forward Command Post was finally on the ground. They'd officially taken over command of U.S. ground forces in the Middle East until 3rd Army, the next higher-level command, arrived and was fully operational in Muscat. As more soldiers arrived, the Marines that had initially inserted began to breathe easier. They'd be relieved and sent back to the carrier group they'd originally been assigned to. Brigadier General Buckner, the Assistant Division Commander for the 82nd, was called in for a meeting with Lieutenant General Luck, the 18th Airborne Corps Commander. Buckner was an accomplished individual, having commanded a brigade in the 82nd Airborne, followed by a one-year assignment in the Pentagon when he was sent back to the 82nd. The Department of the Army had no qualms about jerking brigadier generals around for assignments. It was a tough life as a brigadier general. You were often told to move or transferred to a new position with little, if any, notice. The Pentagon viewed brigadiers like sergeants, to be sent wherever there was a need for a division or XO position. Battalion commanders absolutely respected the man, as he had been a company commander in Vietnam and had distinguished himself under enemy fire. He was also an Army aviator besides being a master parachutist and ranger. Major General Pete Ford was the division commander for the 82nd and would be coming over in the days ahead. Also attending the meeting was the commander of the Marine Expeditionary Force, Colonel Lightfoot. They were in the main terminal of the Jeddah airport, which was now closed to all civilian air traffic. A staff officer from the 18th Airborne Corps was about to give a briefing on the current situation. "Sir, if you're ready, I'll proceed," Colonel Wagner indicated as he stood in front of a wall map of Saudi Arabia, from the area of Tabuk to Riyadh to Al-Lith, some 150 miles to the south of Jeddah. Mecca was only 50 miles southeast of Jeddah. The map was a 1,500,000 scale and measured 7 feet by 12 feet. The red symbols depicted the location of Iraqi forces, while the blue symbols denoted the friendly forces. There were a lot more red symbols than blue ones. General Luck nodded his head to begin. "Sir, the current enemy positions are indicated on this map. These were their known positions as of Oro 300 this morning from a combination of satellite imagery and Human-10 sources. In the north, the 2nd Iraqi Corps advanced on Tabuk, with the 2nd Infantry Division coming down from the north, the 14th Mechanized Division coming from the east, and the 7th coming from the southeast, but having to turn north. It appears they were attempting not to destroy the agricultural areas as they converged on Tabuk. The 37th and 51st Infantry Divisions are in reserve, and following the 2nd and the 14th Divisions," Colonel Wagner said, pausing to check his notes. In the east around Buraida, the 2nd Republican Guard Corps with the 5th Mechanized Division and the 7th Motorized Division have seized the cities of Buraida and Unaiza. Their lead elements are at Ar-Ras at this time. These are the Iraqi ground forces currently in our AO. The 1st Republican Guard Corps is rolling down the eastern side of Saudi, and the lead elements are poised to enter the UAE. Colonel Wagner continued. Brigadier General Buckner shook his head, while Colonel Lightfoot bit down harder on his unlit cigar. So let me see if I have this right, Colonel. You're saying that we're looking at 7 Iraqi divisions coming our way? General Luck asked. Worst case, I would say yes, sir. Looking at Lightfoot and then Buckner, he joked. You guys think you can handle them? Maybe with a little help, sir, Buckner replied, looking over at Lightfoot. Okay, Colonel. Now for some good news, please, General Luck said. Sir, on a more positive note, we do have some help. The 10th Saudi Mechanized Brigade at Tabuk was able to break out to the south thanks to our naval airstrike that hit the 7th Iraqi Division hard. The 10th is currently moving south in company and battalion-sized units over a series of trails, wadis, and highways. Some of the company-sized elements have broken out platoons to set up ambush positions to delay Iraqi forces. The Iraqis, on the other hand, appear not to know about the trails and wadis, so their movement is much slower than the 10th's, which is being made more complicated by the delaying action by the Saudis. Where are the lead elements of the 2nd Iraq Corps now? General Luck asked. Pointing at the map, Colonel Wagner said, The 7th is at Al-Khaliba. The 51st passed them and is at Taima. The 2nd is in Tabuk, with the 14th pushing west to Duba and the coast. This is real shitty terrain, forcing them to go pretty slow on a single-lane road. They had it easy when they left Tabuk, but the escarpments in this area will confine them to any existing roads. We're talking drops of 100 to 300 feet. Once they reach the coast, they'll have a much easier time of running south to Al-Waj and on down to here. The 37th Division is at Madain Saleh, but is going to be getting into some rough terrain and will be confined to roads for the most part, or the wadis. Okay, what does it look like for the 2nd Republican Guard Corps? General Luck asked. Sir, the 2nd Republican Guard Corps has the lead elements of 5th Mechanized Division at Ar-Ras and the lead elements of the 7th Division at Al-Dulaymiya. The Saudi National Guard Brigade, supported by elements of the Saudi Armored Brigade, bloodied their nose in taking Buraida and Unaiza. We have a forward air control team with them, and our guys hit them with an airstrike from the carriers yesterday morning. The 7th Motorized is astride the highway to Medina with the 5th, looking at overland travel on decent terrain to a point about 80 miles east of Medina, where there's a ridgeline running from north to south. For maneuver space, the 5th is probably in a better situation, as the 7th will be confined to roads in some areas. Either way, they both have pretty decent mobility terrain, Colonel Wagner explained as he showed them different parts of the map. Looking at Lightfoot and Buckner, General Luck asked, Your opinion, gentlemen? Buckner was first to offer his thoughts on the matter. Sir, it appears that the 2nd Republican Guard Corps is the biggest threat as it can come at us the fastest. The 14th is further away and has some rough terrain to come through. What's going to cause us some major problems in defending the area is that we can't use Medina. It's one of their holy cities, and putting U.S. forces in there will only strengthen the Iraqis' hand in turning the Muslim population against us. If we could get with the Saudi National Guard and that armored brigade, maybe we can have them break contact, pass through our forces, and re-establish themselves around Medina since we can't. We can get some forces to replace theirs in fighting a delaying action. That would really help slow the 2nd Republican Guard Corps down. In the north, I'd say we find a way to hit the 14th before they get to the coast in those mountains. They won't have anywhere to go if we hit them in the mountains. I agree. If the 14th gets to the coast, they're going to come down on us fast. We need to hit them, and hit them hard in those mountain gorges. Maybe we can even bottle them up in there, or force them to withdraw. I can see getting a FAC team up there with the 10th Mechanized and hitting them with naval air, Colonel Lightfoot said, offering his own insight. That's about 450 miles up there. We're going to need to fly them up with a helicopter and refuel a couple of times along the way, General Luck mumbled, thinking out loud about the possibility. Actually, sir, we can get a C-2A Greyhound from the carrier to come down here and pick up a team with a small security element and fly them back to the carrier. From there, they can land with a couple of helicopters and be inserted. Once the airstrikes are done, they can be extracted by helicopters back to the ship and flown back here, Colonel Lightfoot explained. Colonel, you just laid out your next mission, Luck said. Turning to his operations officer, General Luck told him to get with Colonel Lightfoot and put the plan together. Now, what do we do about the 2nd Republican Guard Corps? General Luck asked. Sir, General Buckner responded, we have an Air Force TACP team with the Saudi National Guard right now. Let's coordinate with the Saudis for them to pass through our lines and become the reserve for us. I now have a full brigade that we can get out there to defend and delay along the highways and wadis. Off the roads and trails, the going will be very difficult. It's ideal light infantry country against mechanized and armor forces. We have the Cav Squadron with their Sheridans and the Rapid Reaction Company from the 24th that will add some weight to our firepower. Toss in some TACPs, and we should make a good showing of ourselves. By the way, any word on when the 101st will start showing up with its attack helicopters? No word on them yet, but they should start flowing in fairly soon, General Luck said, looking at the operations officer. He did not need to say anything, as the operations officer was already writing a note to find out where the 101st was in their loadout. Let's not forget, sir, that I have attack helicopters, light armored vehicles, and some Harrier jets at your disposal until I am ordered back to the ship, Colonel Lightfoot said. Oh, I had not forgotten, Colonel, General Luck said. But I also have to keep in mind that I could lose you at any moment that Marsent decides to pull you back. Having your force continuing to secure the airfield and port is sufficient for now. If we get in a bind, I can make a good case then for keeping you, Luck explained. His explanation seemed to satisfy Colonel Lightfoot. All right, Buckner, get me your plan, and I'll approve it and get you moving. It's a 200-mile trip for your boys to get out there. I've been told that the King has ordered every bus, truck, and car that we need to be placed at our disposal. Gentlemen, we have a plan. Now let's work the plan. Chapter 36. The interview, 10th of August, 1990. Republican Palace, Baghdad, Iraq. We now bring you a report from Peter Arnett, who is on the ground in Baghdad. Peter, what are the latest developments? The CNN anchor asked with deep concern etched on his face in light of this crisis in its 10th day. Good evening from Baghdad, where I just came out of a press conference with Saddam Hussein. He talked first about this conflict being a localized conflict between two Arab neighbors and said that the West should not be concerned with a reduction in the flow of oil, as that is not something they want to let happen. He wanted to emphasize that civilians, especially Western foreigners, were safe and protected within his country and the other Arab nations as well. To prove his point, he had with him Stuart Lockwood, a 5-year-old boy whose parents are petroleum engineers here in Iraq. The screen left Peter and showed a small boy standing next to Saddam, who was seated. The child did not wear a smile, but was rigid and almost trembling. His parents were not in the picture. After a minute, the camera came back to Peter. The other big development today is a joint message from Saddam and Hashemi Rafsanjani, the president of Iran. They are announcing that the Strait of Hormuz will be closed to all military vessels not flying an Iraqi or Iranian flag. Commercial traffic will be permitted with an appropriate pilot on board who knows the strait. In addition, mines are being laid in the strait to close it to military traffic. Iran is laying the minefield in the north, and Iraq is emplacing the minefield to the south. Only one commercial ship at a time will be allowed in the strait, according to my sources, Peter Arnett explained. Well, Peter, "What is the impact of this action going to be in your opinion?" the anchor back in Atlanta asked. "It is quite clear that the flow of oil is going to be greatly reduced if only one ship can traverse the strait at a time. Currently, about 10 ships in a 24-hour period pass through the strait. Add to that the fact that some ships that must come through are not oil tankers, but cargo ships, and the impact becomes very significant indeed." In a voiceover, the anchor asked, "Peter, what has the response from the Western countries been?" Peter raised his finger to his ear and looked down as he listened intently. After a short delay, he said, "This development has not had time to reach the capitals of the world yet. But we can be sure that some nations are not going to take kindly to these actions. The Iranians and Iraqis will be prioritizing which ships can enter the strait. Currently, the priority is set at China, Russia, and France. We have not had a response from Great Britain or the United States. However, we have received reports that U.S. aircraft have bombed Iraqi forces in the area of Tabuk and Buraida, but these reports have not been confirmed." "Thank you, Peter, for this report," the anchor concluded. "Back to you in Atlanta," Peter said and signed off. Chapter 37. Second RG Movement to Seize Medina. 11th August 1990. 7th Adnan Motorized Division, Al-Petra, Saudi Arabia. General al-Karawi, commander of the 7th Motorized Division, was a bit surprised at the resistance the Saudi National Guard and the elements of the 45th Saudi Armored Brigade had put up in Buraida and Unaiza. It definitely got his attention, and it was good for the soldiers to feel the sting of combat, which they had not yet experienced. Things were moving well now, with the 7th Division on the north dominating the highway, and the 5th on the south over open terrain. The 7th Division's lead elements were approaching Al-Petra, moving at 40 kilometers per hour, a good pace, so the equipment wouldn't be stressed. The 12th Motorized Brigade was the lead element with the 1st Battalion on point. The vehicles were in peak operational condition, and the hatches were open to get some air inside the armored shells. The temperature was only 120 degrees today. The soldiers were hoping they'd be able to stop in Al-Petra and hit the stores for soda and water. They had just passed Nubaiha and could see Al-Petra ahead, about 10 clicks on their right, with the beginning of the mountains on their left front. Unbeknownst to them, Major Scooter was observing their movement from his mountain perch. He and his TACP had withdrawn from Buraida when the 45th Armored had. They would keep harassing the Iraqi units until they were relieved or captured. Working with Colonel Faisal, they had planned a kill zone between Al-Petra and Nubaiha. One tank company from the 45th Saudi Armored Brigade was inside Al-Petra, using the buildings to provide concealment for their 9 M60A1 tanks with their 105mm smooth-bore cannons. The effective range for this cannon was 4,000 meters, and the APFSD kinetic energy round could cover that distance in less than 4 seconds. 2 platoons of the company were located in the rugged mountains to the south and positioned in depth to both engage the kill zone and provide cover for the northern tank company to escape west. Added to this, Major Scooter had laid on a FASCAM minefield to be delivered by the Saudi artillery of the 45th Armored Brigade with their 155mm self-propelled artillery. And for added measure, while the Iraqis were dealing with all that, Major Scooter had a flight of 4 F-15s from the 71st standing by with a load of cluster munitions. If this didn't get the Iraqis' attention, nothing would, Scooter thought, as he watched the Iraqi vehicles roll past Nubaiha, heading westbound right into their kill box. The ground was open, hard-packed sand and limestone, so the vehicles were spread out, each attempting to avoid the dust from the vehicle in front. Between Al-Petra and Nubaiha was a north-south road that was the end of the kill zone. When Scooter saw the lead vehicle reach a point 1,500 meters from that road, He called for the FASCAM mines. The first indication of trouble for the Iraqis was the faint, explosive air burst to their front, which they didn't realize was a FASCAM minefield being emplaced. The second sign of trouble was when air-burst artillery exploded above them and showered the vehicles with shrapnel, cutting off antennas and killing anyone that was outside the vehicles. After the first barrage of air-burst artillery, the Iraqi track commanders buttoned up inside their vehicles, which significantly reduced their visibility as they rolled right into the minefield and the prime engagement areas for the anti-tank weapons of the defenders. Once in the minefield, the tracks on the T-72s and the wheels on the BTR-80s and BTR-70s began exploding, stopping the vehicles where they were. Now was the time for the Saudi tanks to engage. The thunderous sound of 17 Saudi tanks firing their main guns reverberated through the area as their projectiles raced across the open terrain like red-hot comets. The Iraqi vehicles were still in the minefield as their tankers and armored vehicles began exploding. Some of the turrets on the T-72s popped off from the explosions as if nothing was holding them on. The remainder of the tank's ammunition, tucked away in the chassis, cooked off, adding more fire to the scene of the battle. The Iraqis attempted to conceal their positions by deploying the smoke grenades attached to their turrets, unaware that the smoke was utterly ineffective against the thermal sights of the M60A1 tanks, which continued to pick them off. What no one initially saw was the 4 F-15 Eagles coming in low and fast from the mountains. As each jet passed over the formation, they released 4 Mk-20 Rockeye cluster bombs. The aircraft flew by at such a low altitude, you could actually see the tail markings on the planes and the names of the pilots. The Rockeyes falling from under their wings would momentarily unsheathe their casings, allowing the casing to spit out the bomblets that would disperse themselves across the Iraqi armored forces. While Colonel Faisal watched the death and destruction being unleashed on those who had invaded his country, his momentary excitement became short-lived. Unseen by anyone were 2 SA-9 Gascon anti-aircraft vehicles following the 2nd and 3rd Battalions. They had picked up the F-15s once they'd come out from behind the mountains and had immediately begun tracking them. The F-15 pilots knew right away that they were being painted and started ejecting flares to throw off any missiles attempting to lock onto them. As the aircraft twisted and turned on their bomb runs, they passed over the 1st and 2nd Battalions. The first 2 aircraft released over the 1st Battalion, while the 2 trailing aircraft released over the 2nd Battalion. That placed them within range of the northern-positioned SA-9. All 4 Stella missiles with infrared tracking were volley-fired and streamed towards the lead 2 F-15s. The first missile exploded on a flare as the aircraft jinked into a hard left turn, exposing his engine exhaust to the second missile coming at him. The missile locked on immediately, resulting in a fireball as the aircraft exploded and came apart. There was no parachute. The second F-15 fared no better as its pilot saw the missiles fired at them with virtually no time to react or think. When the first 2 missiles appeared to go after his wingman, that gave him only a moment to turn sharp left and hit his own afterburner. This gave him only a few more seconds than his wingman had had before the missiles found his afterburner and zeroed in on it. The missile got within range and detonated, throwing chunks of shrapnel and metal into the side of his aircraft. It ripped one wing completely off and caused an engine fire. The aircraft was immediately thrown into a wild, out-of-control spin and splattered against the side of the hill. "Fuck me!" shouted Major Scooter as he looked on in disgust. He hadn't seen the SA-9 or the accompanying 4 ZSU-23-4s. They were normally associated with a brigade element, so he hadn't warned the fighters in advance before they had swooped into the tightly confined valley. They had no room to maneuver. He'd royally fucked up in not making sure they were cleared to enter the valley. He knew he'd hear hell about it from their squadron later. He was thankful the ZSU-23-4s weren't in range to engage the last 2 aircraft, or it would have been a complete bloodbath. "Colonel, time to get your tanks out of here. You hurt them, and you can be damn sure they're going to start hitting back with their own artillery. It's time to scoot and move to the next ambush point and reset," Major Scooter said. No sooner were the words out of his mouth than the first artillery rounds started impacting on the southern hills. The 2 platoons of tanks weren't directly in the artillery's line of fire, but that'd change once the Iraqi forward observers started adjusting their fire. They needed to get the tanks out of there ASAP, or they could add them to the loss column with the pair of F-15s. "They're moving now. They'll fall back to the next position and regroup," Colonel Faisal announced as he lowered a radio hand receiver. He and Scooter climbed into their vehicles, but before the driver could start the engine, Scooter heard something that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the distinctive sound of the Mi-24 Hind helicopter. Worse, he was hearing not one, but at least 2 more, and they were getting closer. Looking over his shoulder, he saw 2 Hinds coming in fast towards Al Petra. The pilots had positioned themselves along the top of the ridge, but just below the crest, so as to not silhouette themselves against the sky. The Hinds weren't moving particularly fast, but they weren't sitting still while they carried out their attack. The first helicopter released a torrent of S-8, or 80mm rockets, at one of the platoons of tanks. The entire area around the armored behemoths erupted in puffs of black smoke, flame, and clouds of dust and dirt. More than 1 secondary explosion occurred amongst the platoon as a handful of the large rockets found their marks. While normally a rocket couldn't penetrate the armor of an M60A1 Patton, this export version of the Patton wasn't as heavily armored as the American version. The second Hind had zeroed in on the other Saudi platoon. Instead of hitting them with a barrage of 80mm rockets, the gunner on this helicopter opted to engage the platoon with its 9K-114 Sturm, or AT-6 spiral missiles. These were SACLOS radio-guided anti-tank missiles with a maximum range of 5 kilometers, giving them a decent standoff range. The Hinds could carry a total of 4 of the missiles, 2 on each wingtip. The remaining 4 inner wing pylons were fitted with 4 rocket pods carrying the S-8 rockets. Colonel Faisal and Major Scooter watched in horror as the 2 Hinds took out 6 of the 8 tanks in their first pass. Both helicopters were now turning in their figure-8 formation to make a second and probably final attack run to finish the last of the platoons off. They'd likely linger around the area a little longer as they looked for more targets of opportunity and took some time to scout ahead for the remaining units as they continued their advance. The American F-15s had done a real number of the brigade. Now the Iraqis were getting their turn. As the reports from the 12th Motorized Brigade came in, General Al-Karawi felt his blood pressure going up the more he listened. They had only traveled 54 miles, and 2 battalions had been virtually destroyed. They still had another 220 miles to go, and the ground was about to become much more rugged and restricted. General Al-Karawi called his staff together to determine what actions they could take. The current plan they had developed wasn't going to work given how fast the Americans had just smashed 2 of his battalions. Looking at the map, it appeared the next major obstacle his force would have to overcome was 39 miles ahead. It was a wide wadi, with the highway crossing over a bridge. There was only a small bridge crossing the wadi. If the Saudis or Americans had already destroyed it, which was what he'd do in their shoes, they'd need to bypass it. Aerial photos showed some approaches into the wadi, giving them another way to circumvent the destroyed bridge, but it also meant they'd have to move through it on only a couple of clear paths. Again, the Saudis or Americans would likely have some sort of trick or ambush waiting for them. As he studied the maps and then the composition of his brigade, a new idea began to form. Perhaps instead of having the 3rd Battalion lead the way, and risking them getting mauled as well, I could take the remnants of 1st and 2nd Battalions and have them go ahead. If they stumble into another minefield or ambush, at least they'll be the ones to get hammered, and not my tanks or heavy firepower units. I'll just need to make sure they are well supported. If we can smash the attackers like we just did those Hinds, that could change the entire outlook for my brigade. When his staff filtered into the room, he sat down and began to explain his idea. One of his battalion commanders suggested they make use of their HIP or Mi-17 helicopters to transport a company of airmobile soldiers. They could go ahead of the main force and look to clear the choke point of potential ambushes. The colonel also suggested they make use of their reconnaissance company and have them scout further ahead of the brigade to some of the other choke points along the way. General al-Qarawi was impressed with the idea and told his commanders to move ahead with it now that they had captured the Prince Nayef bin Abdulaziz airport. The Corps had moved some of the division's aviation assets in. These consisted of the Mi-17 HIPs and the Mi-24 Hinds to transport both airmobile and reconnaissance soldiers. The Hinds were also the division's main ground attack aircraft. They had 42 of them dispersed around the area. The Air Force had moved in a squadron of Su-24s, a squadron of MiG-25, and 2 flights of MiG-29s. The Air Defense Commander informed him that by tonight, a battalion of the new S-300s or SA-10 Grumbles would be operational. All told, they were airlifting some 12 mobile vehicle launchers capable of holding 4 of the missiles aboard 12 Il-76 aircraft, as only one launcher could fit in one aircraft. What made this system so unique was its ability to be built in a piecemeal fashion that allowed the defenders to tailor the system to meet specific needs. In this case, they could disperse the launchers, making them harder to find and subsequently destroy. The radar trucks could also handle a multitude of different roles. In this case, the target detection radar had a range of up to 300 kilometers. The target tracking and missile guidance vehicle could track up to 6 targets at a time at a range of 200 kilometers. This gave them ample time to notify the alert fighters of what was heading their direction and give them time to figure out which missile launchers they wanted to engage the Americans and where they wanted to move other launchers for a better launch point. If this worked correctly, in concert with the Riyadh system, it would give them an SA-10 line that would extend from the Gulf states to Riyadh, to Buraida, to Tabuk. Hearing the good news from the air defense officer, General al-Qarawi started to feel a little better. The Iraqi forces had advanced so quickly that they'd outpaced their air defense systems. As long as they continued to operate under them, the American fighters shouldn't be able to cause them too much damage. Once he'd issued the new orders to get those airmobile troops moved forward, along with his reconnaissance troops, he dismissed everyone. It was now time to let them do their jobs. Chapter 38. 2nd Army Corps moved to Tabuk. 12th of August, 1990. 2nd Iraqi Corps. Sakaka, Saudi Arabia. This cursed terrain is sapping our strength. Behind us looks like a salvage yard at this point, General al-Duri fumed. The terrain had proven to be much more difficult than they had expected. Attempting to move with 3 divisions abreast was proving to be difficult, as the terrain was forcing units on the right flank to crowd south into the rest of the formation. Numerous times, units had become entangled, and each time it happened, it forced their movement to a stop to get it sorted out. The terrain further to the southeast offered easier mobility, but it also was cut with sand dunes and wadis that could stop a vehicle. To make matters worse, flintstones as sharp as knives were everywhere. They were slicing through tires left and right. The armored vehicles with tracks were not affected, but any vehicle with tires was having to stop to change tires anytime they got off the paved roads. It had taken 24 hours to reach 256 kilometers inside Saudi Arabia to Sakaka. Now the divisions would commence a turn towards Tabuk, 384 kilometers to the west. When they did, the right flank had rolling open terrain that would improve his movement. The center also had hard-packed sand to move over, and good mobility, at least it did at first. But then there was some rocky terrain that might prove challenging. General Yai figured that at their current rate of movement, they would be in Tabuk in 24 hours. Of course, all of that was dependent on them not getting mauled from the air by those traitorous Americans who had decided to get involved in this Arab-to-Arab conflict. Once his division commanders were all present, he called the meeting to order and got down to business. "Gentlemen, we have made the turn, but we are not out of the worst of the terrain except for you," he said, looking at the 2nd Division commander. "I want the 2nd Division to come at Tabuk from the north. As you come down from Bir ibn Hirmas, please try not to destroy the crops in the area. These are fertile farms. We are here to liberate, not destroy. The same goes for all of you. The 14th Division will have the most difficult time accomplishing this as you will be coming in from the east. Hold short of the cultivated areas and create a wide screen to prevent anyone from escaping to the east." The 14th commander nodded his head. They all understood al-Duri's desire for them to be seen as liberators, not conquerors. The 7th Division will attack from the south, seize the airport, and block the roads south to Jeddah. We cannot afford to let anyone break out and move south. If we are to move south and join the 2nd Republican Guard Corps, we cannot be held up by elements that manage to escape from Tabuk. Does everyone understand this? Al-Duri asked. They all acknowledged. None of them wanted to look the fool in front of their Republican Guard counterparts. In fact, they were eager to demonstrate that the army was just as good, as if not better, than the Republican Guard. Good. Then let us continue our movement to contact and praise Allah that He will show us His blessings, guidance, and protection as we move forward. General Al-Duri wasn't aware that only 153 miles west of Tabuk, the USS Saratoga carrier battle group had just entered the Red Sea from the Mediterranean. They had traversed the Suez Canal and would now take up station off the coast of Saudi Arabia to begin harassing his corps. The USS Saratoga, CVA-60, had Carrier Air Wing 17 aboard. CVW-17 could easily be identified by the tail code AA. Subordinate to CVW-17 were several squadrons: VF-74, the Bedevilers, and VF-103, the Sluggers, who were F-14A fighter/interceptor squadrons. Next were VFA-83, the Rampagers, and VFA-81, the Sunliners, who were fielding the new FA-18 Hornets, to which the Navy was looking to transition the fleet away from the aging Tomcats. Their attack squadron was VA-35, the Black Panthers. They were flying the venerable and combat-tested A-6E Intruders. Flying alongside them were their kissing cousins, the EA-6B Prowlers, which provided the wing with electronic jamming aircraft, the VAW-125, or Tiger Tails as they were called. They had a small assortment of refuelers, AWACS, and helicopters on board in a support role. All these aircraft working together created a powerful strike package with a total of 80 aircraft. Commander Douglas DePoe-Levin walked into the mission room and loudly declared, "Good morning, gentlemen. Take your seats and we'll get started. We have a lot to cover." Compared to the rest of the pilots in VF-74, DePoe was an old man. Most of his pilots were junior officers with an average of 5 years of flight experience. None of them had combat experience, aside from a few squadron commanders like him who'd managed to catch a combat mission or two over Grenada or Panama. Once everyone settled down, he got started. "Listen up. Today we're flying cover for a strike package flown by the Black Panthers. Seems the Saudis have asked for some help as their Air Force was taken out on day 1 by the Iraqi Air Force. The Black Panthers are going to hit some Iraqi tank columns in the vicinity of Tabuk, and we're providing the interceptor cap. We may see some Iraqi aircraft as this will be the second strike against this particular Iraqi formation. It seems the F-15s out of Egypt from the 71st hit some Iraqi units yesterday morning in the vicinity of Burayda. They made one pass and dropped everything they had before returning to Egypt. They weren't engaged by anti-aircraft fire, but they think it's because their attack surprised the Iraqis." A second flight of 4 F-15s wasn't so lucky. They hit 2 Iraqi battalions, and before they knew what happened, some SA-9s surprised them and flashed 2 of the 4 Eagles. Neither pilot was able to eject either. It turns out one of the pilots killed was the 71st Squadron commander. You guys need to stay frosty. The Iraqis have been outfitted with some state-of-the-art Soviet SAM systems. These guys aren't messing around. As to enemy aircraft, they've been going after our Tomcats with a mix of MiG-25 Foxbats and MiG-29 Fulcrums. The Iraqis have managed to flash 3 Air Force B-52s, 4 Tomcats, an EB-111 Raven, an E-3 Sentry, and 2 more F-15s. You can fantasize about the Iraqis being a second-rate Air Force all you want, but know that they've already shot down a number of our top-of-the-line aircraft. Do not underestimate these guys. He paused for a minute to let some of that information sink in before he turned the rest of the briefing over to the next briefer. Lieutenant Johnson will give you the mission brief and details. I'll see you guys in the air, he said, and then left the room. He had other things he needed to check on before they got airborne. Down the passageway, VA-35, the Black Panthers, had received their mission brief and were heading up the ladderway to man their planes. Several aircraft were loaded with 28 Mk-20 Rockeye-2 cluster bomb pods. They didn't have any ground teams to laze targets for them, so they were going to do the best they could with the good old-fashioned dumb bombs. For armored vehicle and soft vehicle targets, the cluster bombs were very effective. Other aircraft were armed with AGM-62 Walleye TV-guided glide bombs or GBU-12 laser-guided bombs. These precision weapons would be used against air defense weapons as they identified them. It was critically important that they thin the SAMs out early on in this new war. When all was set, the Saratoga turned into the wind and increased speed. Plane captains and deck crews never seemed to get tired of watching the aircraft launch into the air. Flight distance to the target was 200 miles, which for the aircraft of CVW-17 was a short jaunt. Earlier in the day, VW-125 had launched one of its E-2 Hawkeyes, as there was always one watching over the fleet to detect any aircraft approaching that could pose a threat. There were also a couple of F-14 or F-18 aircraft airborne, working with the E-2 to prevent any unfriendly aircraft from even getting close to the fleet. Today, VA-35 would be putting up 20 aircraft, and VF-74 would be covering them with 18 Tomcats. VF-74 took off first and went to a loiter point, waiting for the A-6E intruders to get airborne and start their run to the target area. General al-Duri was pleased at the progress in the past 24 hours. The 2nd Division had reached its checkpoint north of Tabuk at Bir ibn Hirmas, and its lead elements had turned south with no engagements. The 14th Division was east of the city and had paused outside the agricultural areas so as not to destroy any crops. They had spread out from the marsh area northeast of the town to the south for 20 miles. They were positioned between the agricultural lands and the rugged terrain they had just crossed. The 7th Division was the slow one today. They had to cross the roughest terrain, and it had slowed their progress immensely. The one saving grace al-Duri had received in the last 18 hours was that 2 battalions from the 8th Az-Saika Special Forces Division had been heliborne during the evening hours to capture and secure the Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Airport just south of Tabuk proper. The Special Forces had been able to leapfrog ahead of al-Duri's force and took the airport with only minor resistance. Once the airport had been secured, a string of preloaded Il-76 and An-12 cargo planes descended on the airport in the wee hours of the morning. The cargo aircraft had offloaded several SA-9 vehicles and a single battery of S-300s. The S-300 had a single passive search radar, 1 targeting radar vehicle for when they found a target, and 4 launcher vehicles giving them 16 missiles. If they were able to return the following evening, they'd deliver the next battery. Once the battalion had been fully delivered, they'd have established the first line of SAM defenses. Then it'd be a matter of building in the other redundant layers that would make attacking one or more of these hubs that much harder. While Al-Duri was looking at the various maps of the area and where his various units were located, one of his staff officers interrupted him. Practically out of breath, he blurted out, "General, the air defense officer said to tell you we are about to be attacked from the air. It would appear another American force is looking to carry out a large raid on our forces. They'll be here within the next 20 minutes. Damn it, we're not fully ready yet to deal with the Americans. Tell the air defense commander to do his best with what he's got and send a warning out to all the division, brigade, and battalion commanders to have their SAM and AA gun trucks up and running. Maybe we can still give the Americans a bloody nose if we're lucky." General Al-Duri barked angrily. I only needed 48 more hours, and we'd have had enough SAMs to make this a very costly place to fly. I hope our guys can still protect us with what they have, Al-Duri thought. Walking outside his command track, he looked up into the sky, hoping he might catch a glimpse of the action. For the moment, the sky was relatively clear. Then he saw it. A smoke contrail from the ground, followed moments later by the sound of an explosion off in the distance as a missile was streaking its way into the sky, climbing higher and higher as it chased after something unseen. Then he saw a second, and soon a third contrail heading into the sky. Whatever was taking place, it was well outside his ability to see it with his eyes. Instead, he walked back into his tracked vehicle and made sure the radio operator had the frequency switched over to the air defense units. He wanted to listen in. 19th Air Defense Brigade Headquarters. Vicinity of Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Airport. Major Boris Gromov stood behind the Iraqi soldier manning the passive radar screen. The soldier, a lieutenant, was sitting erect, confident in his skills and ability to operate perhaps the most important part of the air defense system. While in passive mode, they wouldn't transmit any electronic signatures that might give away their position. At the same time, they were able to collect a host of electronic information. It was then just a matter of crunching the data and determining what was of value and what was not. As they identified information of value, it was handed off to the targeting and missile guidance vehicle. They were the vehicle that would ultimately engage the hostile aircraft. "You see this spot there?" Major Gromov pointed. "That is an American E-2 Hawkeye. He's running an active radar search to make sure none of our aircraft or other threats head towards the carrier. That blip right there is a second E-2. But the difference is, he is starting to move. That means he is likely providing radar support to a strike package of aircraft heading towards us." "Knowing this, do you think we should pass this information over to the alert fighters?" Gromov asked, wanting to see if the lieutenant would fall back on his training or get frazzled under the stress of it. "I should send a message about what we're seeing to the brigade commander with a recommendation to launch the alert fighters." Gromov smiled. "That's right. Good call, Lieutenant. Now don't forget to pass the information off to the targeting truck. Once the aircraft are within 200 kilometers, they'll be in range to start engaging them." "If we engage from those ranges, won't the Americans be better positioned to evade them?" Gromov nodded. "They will. But keep in mind, the American AGM-88 HARM missiles will need to get within 150 kilometers to engage our launchers and targeting radars. Once the Americans start to engage us, we will switch them off and turn on our secondary targeting vehicle to continue guiding the missiles." A couple of minutes went by with the lieutenant communicating with the other vehicle commanders and the brigade commander about what was happening. When they had observed the Hawkeye cross the 200-kilometer mark, the active targeting vehicle turned their powerful search radar on. What Major Gromov saw caused his stomach to tighten. This wasn't a small raiding force heading towards them. This was a massive strike about to wash over them. The aircraft were showing as 140 kilometers away. Seconds later, the launcher vehicles fired off their 16 missiles. Once their ordnance had been expended, the launcher vehicles would relocate to another launch site, where they'd be reloaded and, if possible, they'd fire off another volley. Major Gromov had done his work. Now it was time to wait for the results and hope the alert fighters might fare a bit better. Chapter 39. Situation Room Meeting. 12th August 1990. Situation Room, White House, Washington, D.C. The phone call from Brent Scowcroft to the President drew everyone to the White House Situation Room. The President, the Vice President, SecDef, SecState, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were present, as were the service chiefs. Even the SecEnergy, the White House Chief of Staff, and the Director of the CIA had rushed over to the White House to be a part of this urgently called meeting. Lieutenant Colonel Atwell stood at his usual position during the start of these briefings and waited for the President to signal for him to start. The President gave his usual nod, letting Atwell know it was safe to get started. Maintaining his serious face, Atwell nodded subtly in reply. Mr. President, a lot has changed since the last brief we provided you, so I'll do my best to get you caught up before the service chiefs will expound on their sections. I'd like to get you up to speed on the air war, as that's where we've lost the most Americans thus far. Holding a hand up, Bush interjected, Colonel, I'd actually like to have General Dugan provide this if you don't mind, since it's primarily his domain. General Dugan looked a bit caught off guard, but quickly regained his composure. He flipped through the slide deck handout until he found the section detailing the air campaign. Mr. President, as you know, and as is currently being reported on the nightly news, the air campaign over Saudi Arabia has been a hotly contested battle. The Iraqi Air Force of the Iran-Iraq War is clearly not the same force we're facing right now. Since the end of that war, their force has improved significantly. Their pilots appear to be better trained and more aggressive, and their aircraft are in substantially better shape. As was mentioned a few weeks ago, the Soviets appeared to have lent the Iraqis many more MiG-29s, MiG-25s, and ground attack aircraft. This allowed them to maul and effectively destroy the Saudi Air Force on the first day of the invasion, General Dugan recapped. In the last 5 days of the air war, the Navy lost 7 F-14 Tomcats, 8 F-18 Hornets, and 4 A-6 Intruders spread across 2 carriers. The Air Force lost 3 B-52 bombers, 2 EF-111 Ravens, 3 F-111 Aardvarks, 1 E-3 Sentry, and 9 F-15 Eagles. I take full responsibility for our initial losses because we didn't fully understand or respect the capabilities of the Iraqi Air Force. This led us to sending in attack formations with fewer air assets than we would have if we were carrying out an attack against a similar Soviet target. I have personally spoken with my Air Force commander, General Horner, who's there right now, and told him in no uncertain terms he's to hold off on launching any further missions until he can ensure he has enough air assets to perform the mission effectively without compromising the lives of our flyers or their aircraft. General Dugan was clearly angered at the losses. He went on, "As a branch, we haven't sustained these kinds of losses since Vietnam. I can assure you we're rushing the deployment of multiple wings to make sure they do not occur again." President Bush sat there taking the information in. It was a bit of a shock, to say the least. He wasn't a man to watch TV, so he didn't really pay it much attention. But hearing about it directly from the man in charge of the Air Force really put the realities of this war into context for him. General Dugan, thank you for the summation of what's transpired these last 5 days, and thank you for identifying the problem and moving quickly to solve it. I appreciate it. I don't have any questions right now, as it sounds like you're already on it. Keep us apprised of the situation. President Bush then returned his attention to Lieutenant Colonel Atwell. Colonel, if you'll resume the brief, that'd be appreciated. Colonel Atwell smiled briefly, then motioned for the slide manager to bring up the next image. First, as we get our slides reorganized, I wanted to tell you about a piece of news that came out last night. At around 200 hours Washington time, the Iraqi and Iranian governments announced in a joint statement the temporary closing of the Strait of Hormuz to all military traffic. Some of the people in the room who hadn't already heard the news audibly grumbled. A few even muttered some curse words under their breath at the audacity of these two belligerents' announcement. Atwell only paused for a moment. He knew there would be some grumbling, and he wanted to make sure their comments didn't interfere with the rest of his brief. "Sir, a satellite passed over their location just a few hours ago and provided us with some real-time data imagery of the strait. It clearly shows the two countries are in the process of mining the strait, with Iran mining the northern portion and Iraq the southern portion. In their statement, they said commercial traffic will be allowed to transit. They wanted to make it clear that the flow of oil will continue. However, there's a catch. They're prioritizing what ships are allowed to transit first. They want to ensure no ships accidentally hit a mine, so they're only allowing one ship to transit through the strait at a time." More grumbles could be heard. Some just shook their heads in frustration and disgust. The Secretary of Energy then interrupted. "Let me guess. Their prioritization of who can transit the strait doesn't include us or anyone that's supporting the Saudis or Kuwaitis?" Colonel Atwell nodded. "That about sums it up. They've set the prioritization with Russia, France, and China in that order. Then it gets a bit murky as to who goes next. Right now, the U.S. has no vessels in the Persian Gulf except our flagship located at Bahrain. There have been no moves against it yet, but that may change now that our aircraft have been actively engaging them." President Bush asked, "What ships do we have nearby they could call on for support should it be needed?" Outside the Gulf and currently located in Muscat, Oman, are 3 U.S. Navy minesweepers. We also have the USS Avenger set to leave their home port in Norfolk to join them later today. The Avenger was recently commissioned and is our newest class of minesweeper. The 3 minesweepers in Oman are Vietnam-era ships. Alongside Colonel Atwell, a picture of a sea mine appeared. It was your typical ominous-looking sphere with contact pins protruding all around it. The Iraqis have an arsenal of approximately 1,500 sea mines. Most are World War II era. However, they have some of the newer Soviet sea mines as well. The CIA has also reported that during their war with Iran, they began producing their own mines, the LUGM-145 Buoyant Contact Mine. It has 3 Hertz horns and is packed with 200 kilograms of explosives. These mines are attached to cables and anchors to allow the mine to float just below the surface, making them incredibly hard to find. The Iraqi tug Jumeirah has been spotted off the coast of the UAE, towing a barge with approximately 45 mines aboard. They've been seeding the south side of the strait. The picture changed to show the Strait of Hormuz and the approximate location of the Iraqi minefield. The Iranians have approximately 6,000 sea mines, which they developed extensively during the Iran-Iraq War. This slide also indicates where they're seeding the north side of the channel. These are both contact mines and influence mines. "Excuse me, Colonel, Mr. President, but what is an influence mine?" the Energy Secretary asked. The President nodded for Colonel Atwell to answer the question. "Sir, an influence mine sits on the bottom and will be activated when either a metal object passes over it or cavitation from a ship's propeller and the noise of the ship set it off. With these mines, we rely on helicopters towing a sled to detonate the mine or on our minesweepers, which are built out of wood." The USS Avenger, which is the newest minesweeper in the fleet, commissioned in '87, has a wooden hull that's then covered in fiberglass, giving it a low metallic signature, Colonel Atwell said. "Thank you," the SecEnergy said. "Continue, Colonel. the president directed before taking a couple of long sips from his coffee mug. Yes, sir. Currently, the British have the largest and probably the best minesweeper force in the world. Colonel Atwell was interrupted by the president. Wow, he said, looking at the chief of naval operations. Admiral Kelso, what's the status of our minesweeper force? The admiral knew this was coming and was not looking forward to the question. Mr. President, we currently have 11 minesweepers in the force, located throughout the world and home-based on the east and west coasts as well as Japan. Avenger is the newest of the ships, but the rest are pre-Vietnam era ships, and frankly, our operational rate has not been good. With budget cuts and higher priorities, our minesweeper force has suffered. Avenger and 3 other minesweepers are being loaded on a transport ship and will be departing tonight for the Middle East. We have 3 ships in the Far East that we're dispatching as well to SingCentCom and Comnavcent. They'll all be in the area of operations in approximately 20 days, Admiral Kelso said. In addition, the USS Tripoli, a helicopter carrier, will arrive in that same time period to assist in mine-clearing operations and serve as the flagship for those operations, the admiral quickly added. So we wait at least 20 days before we can get in there to open the strait, is what you're telling me? The president asked for clarification. Secretary Cheney saved the CNO and took this question. Sir, the chairman and I have spoken to General Schwarzkopf about opening the strait, and his concern is that we're liable to provoke the Iranians, drawing them in to support the Iraqis. He feels that until he has the forces in place, it's best not to poke that particular snake yet. In the meantime, we're tasking our satellite resources to continually follow the mining operation. This is allowing us to plot where they're being put down. When we're ready to move in, we'll know where they are with a high degree of certainty, so clearing them should be relatively quick and easy. If I may, Mr. President, the director of the CIA, Mr. Tenet, intervened. Seated next to him was Vice Admiral Studeman, a quiet man and the director of the National Security Agency. Go ahead, the president acknowledged with a raised eyebrow. If the CIA was adding something, then it was usually worth listening to. Mr. President, we have satellite coverage over the area with 90-minute intervals between the passing of the 2 birds. We've been receiving priorities of coverage from multiple clients, each claiming a higher priority than the other. Sometimes we can accommodate 2 or more clients with each pass. However, requests for coverage over the strait have only one client, the Navy, and only a small fraction within the Navy. Looking for sea mines doesn't rise to the level of a high priority unless CENTCOM comes up loudly on the net, and they have not, the director explained. The president looked back at Mr. Cheney. Sir, General Schwarzkopf doesn't feel that it's a priority to expend time on the satellites looking for sea mines when there's nothing we can do about them at this time. He argues that this is why we have minesweepers and we should let them do their job when the time is right. The British also happen to have a larger fleet of these ships than we do, and between our 2 navies, they shouldn't have a problem clearing them. He wants the satellites to be focused on helping him track the Iraqi formations, which pose the greatest threat to our current and future operations. I hate to admit it, but he's not wrong about that. The Iraqi Air Force has also been surprisingly more effective than we thought they would be, which is another reason he wants more satellite time. The Air Force is having a hard go of locating where the Iraqis are moving their squadrons around, which makes it harder for us to engage them, Mr. Cheney said, explaining the crux of the problem in greater detail. President Bush scoffed. Well, I don't like it. You'd think after all the billions spent on defense over the last decade, we'd have been better positioned for a situation like this. At the same time, Schwarzkopf makes a good point. So here's what I want us to do. Get those U-2s operational, and let's start having them provide us with continual surveillance of the Iraqi forces. Let's even see if they can help us watch where the Iraqis and Iranians are laying those mines. The president then turned to his Secretary of Energy. I want you to talk with our domestic oil producers and see if they can increase their production as high as they can get it. This crisis in the Gulf is going to put a huge crimp in the world economy if we can't fill in the oil shortage it's going to create. The Secretary of Energy scribbled some notes down on his pad. He mentioned a few other things they could do to help the Europeans. The President agreed, telling him he had his marching orders for what his department should do next. Bush returned his gaze to his Secretary of Defense next. What forces has General Schwarzkopf asked for, and how soon can we get them in country? Sir, I have a list of his initial requests, Mr. Cheney replied, as he signaled the slide operator to bring up his slide. Oh, you'll see that we had initially called this Operation Desert Shield prior to the Iraqis invading Saudi Arabia. Our goal was to get the Iraqis to back down and protect the Saudis. Clearly that didn't happen as they invaded before we could get any U.S. forces on the ground. When the ground war commences, and we go from the defense to the offense, the operation will change from Desert Shield to Desert Storm. On the slide is the initial force package Schwarzkopf has requested. This will likely change as the situation on the ground changes. We're still having to keep our eyes on Europe. East Germany is nearing its final days and will likely rejoin West Germany in a matter of weeks. But that hasn't deterred some of the hardliners in the Soviet Union from exerting their control in other Warsaw Pact countries. So while we're gearing up to fight this war in the Middle East, we need to stay ready for whatever the Soviets may try in Europe. I get it, Dick. We need to keep an eye on Europe and handle the Middle East. Give me a moment to look at the slide, will you? Snapped Bush, a bit irritated with the history lesson. He had used to run the CIA and had been vice president under Reagan for 8 years. The president put his reading glasses on and looked at a handout of the slide, rather than strain his eyes by looking at it on the wall. He mumbled a few times to himself and scribbled a note here and there. They read as follows. Operation Desert Shield. Initial Ground Force Package. 82nd Airborne Division, Fort Bragg, NC. 24th Infantry Division, Mechanized, Fort Stewart, GA. 197th Infantry Brigade, Mechanized, Fort Benning, GA. HQ, 17th Airborne Corps, Fort Bragg, NC. 101st Airborne Division, Air Assault. Fort Campbell, KY. 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, Fort Bliss, TX. 1st Cavalry Division, Fort Hood, TX. 1st Brigade, 2nd Armored Division, Fort Hood, TX. 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, Fort Bliss, TX. 3rd Corps, Artillery, Fort Sill, OK. 1st Corps Support Command, Fort Bragg, NC. 13th Corps Support Command, Fort Hood, TX. 12th Combat Aviation Brigade, Germany. 3rd Armored Division Aviation Elements, Germany. 7th Medical Command, Germany. HQ 3rd U.S. Army, Fort McPherson, GA. When the President finished reading the slide, he looked up at Colonel Atwell. Colonel, I see a lot of Army units on this request, but what about the Marines? Do we have them on the way yet? Atwell nodded. Yes, sir. The 1st Marine Expeditionary Force out of California, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Brigade in Hawaii, the 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade on the East Coast, and the 7th Marine Expeditionary Brigade in California's Mojave Desert were all given warning orders 10 days ago and final deployment orders 4 days ago. Their equipment just finished being loaded, and the ships are taking on their final provisions and munitions. They'll start loading the Marines tomorrow, with the convoys setting out in the next 24 hours. Again, it's going to take around 20 days for most of these forces to coalesce in the Middle East, which will give us time to finalize where we want them to disembark. The president scrunched his eyebrows at the statement. This all sounds great, Colonel, but we're talking about a lot of Marines and their equipment. Where exactly are we putting all these people? Is Jeddah still going to be the launch pad to liberating Saudi Arabia? Sir, said General Powell, finally speaking up and joining the conversation. The Iraqis have overrun almost every port in Saudi Arabia of any capability except Jeddah. That port really doesn't have the capacity to handle the size of forces needed for an operation like this. We're asking that we be allowed to use Muscat, Oman for our staging base and port from which to liberate Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Mr. President, Jim Baker said loudly to gain the president's attention, I've spoken with the Sultan of Oman, and he has opened the door for us to stage forces and use his ports and airfields. He is also allowing the Saudi government to go into exile to be located there. In addition, I've spoken to President Mubarak of Egypt, who is allowing us to use Egyptian air bases. If you call him directly, he just may be willing to commit ground forces to join our coalition. Mubarak is seriously pissed that he got Saddam and the Kuwaitis talking to avoid war, only to have Saddam stab him in the back and use those talks as a pretext to invade not only Kuwait, but now Saudi Arabia, and look to invade the rest of the Gulf states. Is that the best we can do? Is there no place else for us to launch this operation from? The president seemed skeptical about launching a liberation that would essentially have them march clear across the entire Middle East. Not an easy thing to do. Sir, at this point I'm afraid this is our best bet. We're going to look to open 2 sustained fronts, one from Jeddah and one from Oman, Mr. Cheney explained. As of right now, it looks like the Egyptians will join us if you call and ask Mubarak personally to join. Maybe we can even make him the head of the Arab coalition, and he might convince others to join as well. Then we have the British, who have indicated they are going to commit forces, but, aside from minesweepers, at this point can't say what else they will bring to the table. Unfortunately, the King of Jordan hasn't given us permission to stage out of his country or use any of his air bases. We don't believe he'll join our coalition, though Mubarak might be able to help persuade him. We're also negotiating with Turkey to see about opening a front via northern Iraq. The problem with Turkey is they have a large Kurdish population, and if we end up liberating northern Iraq from Saddam, then it's likely they may see a Kurdish uprising of their own. This is probably why the Turks aren't going to participate in any action against Iraq, or allow us to stage a ground invasion either. They'll allow us to stage aircraft to attack Iraq. But that's about it. For the time being, Oman is our best bet. The president looked at Jim Baker. Jim, set the call up for me to speak with the Sultan to thank him for his support, as well as Mubarak.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.